All right, I think we'll make a start. I hope everyone had a lovely morning tea break. Before we go on to the next presentation, there was a question that came in after Tracy's presentation asking whether the report, and I guess the fellowship reports, will be made publicly available. The answer is yes, they will. They are currently undergoing review and there's a bit of a production process, but we do expect the fellowship reports to start being available from mid-May to June onwards. So they will be published on our website. So you can check on our website periodically, or if you subscribe to the ACSES newsletter and our website, you would get notifications as and when events, publications, resources gets published. All right, now it is my pleasure to welcome our next Equity Fellow, Dan Keenan, who will be speaking to us on her fellowship titled Roadmap to Success, Decoding the Regional University Study Hubs. Thanks, Dan. Let's welcome Dan.
How are we all? Let's see if I can work out the buttons. So before I'd like to start, I would just like to acknowledge country that we're on today, but also the country that I'm from, which is the Wili Yallowarra country in far western New South Wales in Broken Hill, but also to acknowledge all the traditional owners of the lands in which this research took place. It was quite vast, and you'll be able to see on a little map in a second. Now, I feel like Christy stole my show and introduced you to the regional hubs more than maybe I can reiterate some of those things. So the project was decoding the regional university study hubs. And the reason I put in this application was because it's quite a new policy initiative in terms of widening participation for those in regional remote communities, but there hadn't been a huge amount of research on the impact of the hubs. So I sought to explore that impact as part of this fellowship. And just to give you some context, I live and work and grew up in Broken Hill in far western New South Wales. I've raised my family there, and I am a practitioner from the regional university study hub sector. And have worked in higher ed through the University Department of Rural Health there as well. So I have a long history with supporting students in regional areas, and I'm also a direct beneficiary of the hubs, having completed my postgrad at the hub in Broken Hill when it was opened. I was the manager there, and having the opportunity to support students also inspired me to go on to further my education. But also I see the impact of that hub on the broader community, but also more broadly in terms of my personal experience as well for my family. And I have the privilege of hearing my kids tell me how they're going to go to mum's uni and how their friends are going to go to mum's uni because they don't want to leave home. So just to reiterate what Christy has already said to us is that the regional hub started, so the Regional University Study Hub program actually started in 2019. However, it can actually be broken into two timelines. So the first regional hub prior to federal government funding was actually in 2001 here in WA at the Geraldton University Centre. And in 2018, prior to federal government funding, there are actually 6 hubs across Australia, either established and operating or commencing establishment. And these were all started through community run, philanthropic or state government funding and industry funding to support these hubs. So the communities realised that they were experiencing either a brain drain, so youth were migrating out of their communities, or needed to build the aspirations of people living in those communities that there was possibility for them to stay and continue their education, making more resilient communities is, I guess, the outcome of that. But the stats that Christy read out earlier are actually quite important. So the hub program has supported over 15,000 students since 2019 when the federal government funding was announced. And this year alone it's over, so this data probably needs to be updated, but it's over 5,000 students just in this year alone. So these are all the locations of the hubs on the other side. But importantly, many of the students are female, many are first in family. Myself, for example, I was the first to finish high school in my family. We have a high proportion and comparable proportion of First Nation students to that of the communities that they're in. 6 to 7% disclosed disability, but the majority are starting at a bachelor level and above, with the highest disciplines studied being health, education, and social service. And these kind of align with regional workforce needs. But I think the important thing is to note that the statistics is important because, yes, it is supporting, these hubs are supporting students that have been traditionally underserved by higher education, but also it's an equity tool because many of our students face compounding and accumulative effects of equity, and we're supporting a huge diversity of students. And when I say we, I mean the hubs. So in terms of my project, the approach was to analyse the different types of hubs. So there are 5 hub typologies, which I'll go into a little bit further later. And so what I decided to do was examine 9 of the 34 regional study hubs to understand, to make considerations around the variability of funding. So Cohort 1, it was the first funding round in 2019 with 16 hubs, and then cohorts 2 and 3 were the 2 years prior following on. So what we wanted to look at is what were the characteristics of the hubs at different levels of their maturity. And understand what impact they have in terms of their widening participation abilities. So like I mentioned at the beginning, there has been research that states that they widen participation, but we haven't really seen any data around what actually is the impact, but also what are the characteristics that help them to increase access and participation outside of those facilities. And then also we wanted to use the information to provide further support for the hubs back to the department and have an impact on future policy and decision making. So back to the typology. So while each regional hub is very unique, a 2021 evaluation of the hubs was commissioned by the department. So this isn't available publicly. It was only available to those hubs that participated in the evaluation. But the evaluation created 5 typologies. And these typologies were used as part of the methodology for the project because it was the only piece of information that we had that could distinguish the characteristics of the hubs to ensure that when I was going out and doing field work, that I was looking at a broader range so I could get the diversity of those hubs. So the regional campus model, so I'll just explain these a little bit. The regional campus model was based off of that Geraldton model where they had direct partnerships with universities to provide content support and content to students that were enrolled with those partnered universities. So very much a satellite campus type of model, but they had multiple university partners. The affiliated network was the Country University Centres network, which you may have heard of. They are an umbrella organisation that support multiple communities. So each hub is still community owned, and they affiliate in to get an additional layer of expertise and support from the umbrella organisation. But they operate in terms of supporting students as an institution neutral way. So any person from any provider can access the services and still get general academic support regardless of the institution that they're in. The Indigenous student focus. So these were the hubs that were in remote locations in the Northern Territory, and they were grouped together, one because of the remoteness, but also because of their focus on supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and also the delivery of their services was focused on tertiary pathways and enabling programs. And then vocational non-accredited training integration. So these were hubs that had a strong workforce connection, but also wanting to link in those vocational and workforce providers within their hub environment. And then the tertiary hub, which acted similarly to the affiliated network model in that very institution neutral way. They all have university partnerships. It is a requirement of the grant, but those types of partnerships actually influence the way that they deliver services. So in terms of these typologies, it's pretty well known within the hub sector that they're not reflective of how the hubs actually operate. So the evaluation was done with only a small number of cohort 1 and some cohort 2 hubs at the time, but due to programmatic changes within the Rush program, but also communities getting a better understanding of what their community needs are and how they support students, this has evolved quite extensively. Am I pressing the wrong button? So for my project, like I said, I wanted to look at the different types of hubs, but also consider the maturity of the hubs, so how old they were and where they were in their life cycle, their journey of operating, but also the state-based and geography factors actually play into it as well. So I made sure that I had variability across those ages, but also states and also the types of hubs from that previous evaluation. So I travelled all over Australia to do fieldwork. The fieldwork took me, I made sure that I spent at least 3 to 5 days in each location. And I also ensured that I travelled in ways that would also demonstrate the travel which would be required from a student. So I live in Broken Hill, that little dot there. So I was travelling from a remote community to other remote communities. So I did definitely experience the tyranny of distance. But I would fly to a capital city and then make sure I drove into that community to kind of understand the challenges that these communities were facing. It was an absolutely amazing experience to undertake all of this field work. I've been to places that I never would have been before, but also the experiences of the students and the communities that I went to and their willingness to share was absolutely a highlight. And particularly, Christy mentioned Weirgibba earlier. I was able to go to East Arnhem Land and experience a very life-changing opportunity going there. So yes, I'm feeling very privileged that I got to explore these beautiful communities and being so welcomed by these communities as well. So in terms of the project and the methodology, so we used a mixed method approach. So qualitative methods included semi-structured interviews when I was out on the fieldwork, practitioner ethnographic observation. So part of that was that travelling out there, but understanding the environment in which these hubs are set up and the challenges or opportunities they see. And also an online survey as well to get a broader range of perspectives outside of just the fieldwork sites. Quantitatively, we looked at ABS census data as well as some of the Rush performance data and evaluations that were available at the time, and obviously the literature, which there was quite limited literature given that the program's only 6 years old. So this is me at Weirgibba with Mob out there. It was some lovely anecdotes about the trip if anyone wants to hear them later. So the quantitative analysis. So when we were looking at all the literature, there were these statements that were being made about how the hubs widened participation, but we couldn't find any quantitative data that actually confirmed that. So our first objective was to actually identify whether they did widen participation. And to do that, we looked at census data. So we had 180 postcodes across the 3 cohorts. So what we only looked, there are actually 56 hubs open at the moment, but at the time of doing this project, we only looked at the 34 that were operational, so they're the cohorts 1 to 3. At the time of commencement, cohort 4 had been announced, but they weren't operational yet. So we looked at 180 postcodes within a 30-metre drive zone from the hubs to see whether, looked at their access of higher education and how that changed over the census periods from 2021 to 2016 and then 2016 to 2021. To see what changes were made in those locations where the hubs were. We did have to exclude some postcodes out of that 180 because the Northern Territory has limited postcodes for a huge landmass area, so it was methodologically inconsistent. And also there were 9 postcodes that didn't have any higher education participation, including one near Broken Hill. So the final sample was 171 postcodes. Cohort 1 has the largest amount because it was actually the largest cohort of funding that's been announced. 37 postcodes from cohort 2 and 34 from cohort 3. And we included cohort 4 postcodes as well, as we would use that as kind of a baseline. So we could kind of compare whether communities that had been identified as in need of regional hubs, so used it as a control group essentially. So what we identified was that cohort 1 and 2 had quite a significant increase from declines the previous census period, so 24% increase in terms of their higher education participation on average across those cohorts. Cohort 3 was similar at about 17%. And then cohort 4, which we kind of used as that control group, had just an 8%, which was more similarly in line with the national average in terms of that increase of participation. So on average, across those first 3 cohorts, 19% increase in terms of widening participation impact within those postcodes 30 kilometres from the hub location. We also did some further analysis to kind of understand whether the location mattered in terms of the hub. So this is one of the hub sites that we did the analysis on. So location A is that top one there with the highest increase, is actually the location in which the hub is situated. And the other ones are the communities that are in that 30-metre drive zone. So you can see both for university enrolment and also vocational enrolments, they had a quite steep incline where it's a little bit less for those other communities around it. And we kind of used the qualitative information to understand more why were they not, why was the location so significant? And what we identified was it was actually sociocultural things. So things like Community B would never go to Community A because they have to go to Community E for other services. So they didn't travel in that direction to access other services. Or I would never go to Community A because we play that team against sport, and it was sporting and social norms that were influencing it. But also the other thing was transport, lack of public transport, or being not having the finances to actually use a personal vehicle to travel that 30 kilometres as well. So some of those, so the barriers are kind of, it's more broad than just putting a hub in a location than expecting everybody across a 30-minute drive zone to actually go to that location. So on the fieldwork, I conducted 57 interviews with participants across 3 groups. So students of the hubs, the staff within the hubs, and also community representatives. So each of the hubs is community owned and run. So they're run by their own boards and community members. So community members, that group of participants was made up of board members, also community champions, so people that may not be on the board but had actually championed and participated in the establishment of that centre through the application phase. Industry, so whether they were industry partners, and even some university staff as well contributed to that group of participants. So what we looked at was common themes across all participants, with widening participation being the top across all participant groups, as well as the role of staff at the hubs and partnerships with higher education. So partnerships with higher education was one that came up with both strengths and challenges in the data that we collected. Am I still pressing the wrong button? Yeah. So we also looked at participant variation. So staff obviously discussed financial matters and operational matters more. Students focused on the impact of staff and accessibility. And then community members highlighted funding models and also that higher education the partnerships as well. I'm going to have to read this bit. Sorry. So I pulled some quotes across the themes on that highlighted the sentiments across participants. So participants consistently highlighted that the regional hubs increase access to higher education, particularly for those students that might not have accessed it without the hub. And there was a significant number of participants, especially those that were mature age, that said without the hub, or mature age and also with family responsibilities, that without the hub they wouldn't have been able to succeed. Impact of staff. So this brought me joy. I loved listening to the impact of staff across these hubs and also the perspectives of students. But staff are described as crucial to the success for both students, but also the success in general of the hub. And students particularly emphasise the role in providing personalised support and guiding students through university processes that would have been previously unfamiliar to them. And they also offered emotional encouragement, so that kind of wellbeing and pastoral care element as well. And students often stated that they were approachable and that they were welcoming, and that made them feel more comfortable and confident to progress in their studies. Also, there was an agreement that the staff that had a strong connection to the community were also I guess, better at providing support because they understood the community as a whole and how to help that student navigate through different workforce objectives and things like that. And then partnerships. So there were mixed experiences around the partnerships, particularly with higher education providers. The hubs that offered that supported degree, so where that content support is offered in partnership, they spoke more highly of those partnerships with higher education providers, where those hubs that were more institution neutral or from quite smaller, more isolated communities said that they found it difficult to work with partners because they felt like it was a bit of a numbers game, essentially. You know, why would we partner with you guys when you're only going to give us 5 students? So there were those kind of sentiments that came through, and I'll explain some of that in a bit more detail later. But there were some really positive examples of partnerships that were happening with higher education providers and the hubs. It's very eye-opening. I think those partnerships are essential. The survey, so we sent out the survey to 26, well, we sent out the survey to the 34 hubs that were in cohorts 1 to 3. 26 participated, with most from cohort 1 because obviously that was the highest. This has got a typo, sorry. So some hubs belong to multiple funding rounds. Should be decreasing total responses. So some hubs responded from multiple hubs within there. Yeah. So we asked hubs really the questions that we were trying to discover. What are the characteristics, like are they widening participation? What are the characteristics that contribute to that? And then also how can we influence future policy? So the survey was directed at their either hub managers or centre managers. So we also included more operational type of questions. So what are their staffing makeups and what are their partnerships look like? What are their funding and things like that? So they were more targeted at the specific participants. So the survey results, almost all said that they offer course navigation, supporting students to navigate into higher education, as well as other common services like academic advice, outreach, so doing widening participation activities, and then workforce development. Staffing on average from what we collected was about 3.2, but there was a high variation. And this variation, when we confirmed with participants and through the data, was because they've got access to external funds, whether that's through university partnerships, state government funding, or other industry funding. So on average, it was we predict it's a lot smaller given the quantity of the grant isn't that high. And then university partnerships. So most, all hubs collaborate with the universities, but they frequently said that the non-financial partnerships that they have were seen more valuable than the financial partnerships that they had with the universities. We also looked at, we asked the participants on what the what they thought impacted more on their widening participation ability. So we asked them to rate, with 1 being not important and 5 being most important, university partnerships, locally staffed student services, community engagement infrastructure, resources, academic services, and local partnerships. So local partnerships and community engagement was obviously the biggest, as you can see from the graph here, with university partnerships rated at the lowest. But there is a caveat here. So this survey, when it was distributed, coincidentally coincided with the announcement of cohort 5 funding round for the hubs. And there was, in that cohort 5 funding round, there was the opportunity for universities to apply for funding. And this was the first time in the program that had occurred. And so this funding change, I think, caused some uncertainty with the existing hubs that were already operational and their community-owned place-based ethos that they have. So it may actually have negatively impacted on some of these survey responses in terms of those partnerships. Aspirations, so looking forward, what the hubs would actually like to do in the future. They all wanted to increase their student numbers and community engagement, so build that aspirational pool, so continue to offer students an opportunity to come in and use the hubs. Many needed or asked for new or upgraded facilities and infrastructure, and this was something that was identified in the fieldwork as well. Often these hubs are, they're not purpose-built, they're purpose renovated and using existing infrastructure within those communities to make them fit best they can. And also a lot of the hubs had predicted what their student numbers may be, but had all essentially exceeded that more than what they expected. So they were having to modify spaces to fit all the students in, but also all of the activities that the students were doing as well within the hub. So infrastructure and upgrades was one that came up quite a lot. They all wanted stronger university partnerships. So whilst they said it was not as important in the survey, they actually see that they recognise that they are important to their widening participation functions. And then they also wanted to expand services. So under the grant, where the grant funds you to provide student services and facilities, but they wanted to extend those, so offering things like career guidance, widening participation outreach, which is widening participation is a function of the grant, but not an activity within the grant. And then course delivery. So those communities that didn't have those higher education partnered supported courses, there were aspirations for them to actually have those. In terms of policy changes, they wish they had more money, essentially. More money for staffing, more money to increase services, and more money to make their infrastructure better fit for their communities now that they'd already been established and had started, and a greater level of professional development and marketing. So they wanted greater strength in the regional university study hub network. So the network was created in 2020. I might get that wrong, to support all of the regional hubs. So there's an advisory group, which is represented by hubs across each of the states, and it's led by ACSES to provide additional level of resources and support for those hubs. And there was a consistent amount of responses saying that they want that deepened, they want that support deepened. More meaningful university partners, and then also it was interesting, they talked about the government support and sustainability. So these hubs are funded for 3 and then 4-year funding rounds, which in terms of government funding is actually quite a long time. But they did note that they wanted more, essentially. We all want more. But overwhelmingly, survey participants believe that the hubs significantly contribute to the success of students. So practitioner ethnographic observation. So I used my experience working within the hub. So I ran the Broken Hill Centre prior to federal government funding, and I also work with the country university centres. So I've had an opportunity to explore more than 50% of the operational hubs. So using that experience to look at those things like physical environment and infrastructure and how that's established to support the students in the community and what kind of engagement they're getting and things like that. Also staff and operations, what do their staffing models look like? How are they operating? How are they extending their services outside of those grant obligations? What activities they're doing. So widening participation activities was one that was common, workshops with students, how they're building that sense of belonging essentially within their hubs. Also what community involvement and community participation there was. One of the hubs I attended a widening participation activity, and they had every industry from around the whole region and every university within that state, and it was just absolutely fantastic to see the community involvement. Actually, there was multiple hubs like that. And also the cultural and social atmosphere. So the cultural and social atmosphere was interesting because we were looking at the layout of the hubs, how they encourage that, but also things like they had LBGTQ plus, whatever. I'm sorry, I balls that up. Signage, so the welcome here signage. Also, they had Aboriginal art. Throughout their buildings, they had in communities that had high Aboriginal populations, they would have rooms named in the languages of those communities. They also had all of the kind of meeting the accessibility needs of students, so different headphones, different quiet rooms, different wobble chairs, depending on what the needs were of their actual student. They were making sure they were meeting those. So that was period products as well, all throughout the hubs, as well as food and things like that. So the social atmosphere and kitchens particularly were really social spaces within the hubs, really vibrant. Okay, so in terms of the findings, so regional hubs do widen participation. So looking at all of the data that we collected, it would suggest that yes, they do widen participation. And the way in which they do that is, one, having access to those study spaces and the facilities and the amenities within them. Having access outside of business hours was another response from students that came through really strongly in terms of making the environment more accessible. And then belonging and identity. So students particularly talked about feeling like a student, feeling like they had peers and a network of other students that they could collectively identify with. And also, I think one thing that I picked up in my observations was the conversations that I was having outside of the hub. So going to the coffee shop, and people would say, because I looked like an outsider, "Why are you here?" And I would say, "I'm looking at the hub," and they then would talk to me about what it meant to their community and what they'd seen in terms of the change within their community, like Christy mentioned about the quote. So it was interesting to see how, and coming from a small mining community where your aspirations as a man is to go into mining and as a female is to do hairdressing or retail, I've personally experienced that shift in my own community where something that was seen as not possible is now possible. So that collective identity from a community's perspective was something that was highlighted a lot. And then the cultural responsiveness, so understanding who their students are and how to meet their needs helps to widen participation as well. And I would say the one that was talked about most in terms of all of the data that we collected was actually the role of staff. So in building engagement with students, but also building self-efficacy and being relational navigators. So understanding who the student is and then how to direct them to the best possible resources to support their education. But also because the hub staff support students from any institution, it's not about knowing every single institution's pathways and programs. It was about sitting and learning with that student and helping them to navigate, and then also passing that information on to the next student that come in with a similar kind of need. So this quote on the side here, this analogy, you teach a man to fish and he'll live for life, that come up no less than 4 times in some way through the data, through the responses that we collected. And then partnerships. Partnerships do contribute to the widening participation effect of the hub. So with higher education institutions, it was about building aspirations and then supporting student needs. Other education providers, so TAFEs and schools, so building that aspirational pool, but also showing real pathways to higher education. And then community as well. So councils, regional development and industry were all important contributors to the widening participation impact of the hubs. And this is a little bit left of the research question, I guess, but it had to be included in terms of the finding. But the contribution to regional development, this needs further exploration, I think, further research done into it in terms of the economic impact that the hubs have. But it did provide an opportunity for people to stay in community and reduce that brain drain that was talked about so much in the data. But also contribute to regional prosperity. So we heard earlier about how increasing people's ability to access education then will build the prosperity of our country, but it is really important to build the prosperity and the resilience for our regional communities as well. So other contributions I made through the research. So that original typology, like I said, didn't really reflect the hubs and how they operate and the diversity. So we made an attempt, and this is an experimental typology, to type the hubs and be able to support future research and exploration through the program as well. So I've broken it up into a two-type typology, the operational distinction model, and it's very much based around the university partnerships and how they're structured. So the partnered course model is one where those hubs have direct partnerships with higher education providers to support or deliver content as part of those partnerships. And then the institution neutral model, which is the ones that operate more agnostically. They all operate in an institution neutral way, I will say that, but it provides more generalized support to students. So they have formal and informal partnerships, but it doesn't influence the service delivery. You'll often find recruitment for different courses and things that are happening within the partnered course model, where in the institution neutral, they don't have those kind of marketing and recruitment or that can often happen in the partnered course model, or promotion of or course navigation into. We also looked at what was the operational characteristics of the hubs and what their priorities were. So we identified that the motivations or priority areas for hubs was regional development, enabling programs or pathways, widening participation, vocational education, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander support. All of the hubs have these characteristics, but it's the degree in which they prioritize or put emphasis on, and that changes. So it doesn't actually influence the operational distinction model, but it is important to acknowledge that they do have different priorities based on their community needs. And so the geographic and state-based factors influence their approach to partnerships and operational priorities, as well as the demographic factors and community-driven factors within that community as well. So in terms of recommendations, more hubs for everybody. We talked a lot. It was amazing research because it was extremely positive. All I heard when I was out in field work and through the surveys was how amazing these were for communities, and that we wish there were more. Many hubs wanted to extend their outreach and into nearby communities, or had been approached from other communities about establishing one. So more cohorts of funding would be fabulous. Also increasing the flexibility. There's a mechanism within the program at the moment that supports partnerships, but it's very programmatic, and there was some concern that it wasn't as advantageous as the previous funding mechanism. So having a look at that mechanism and seeing if there can be more flexibility established within that. But also the hubs contribute to state government workforce. So it would be ideal if the state governments contributed to these hubs as well in terms of their funding, allowing them to increase that services as they have aspirations for. Also developing standards of practice to guide the hubs without imposing regulation. So the hubs kind of sit in a third space, I guess. There are outside regulatory requirements that they have to ensure that they meet to meet the conditions of grant, but providing those resources and standards of practice to help ensure that they are meeting those, to assure funders and partners that the services that are provided within the hubs are quality, without kind of imposing regulations, but also making sure that there's appropriate resources for the regional university study hub network to be able to deliver those standards of practice as well. Stronger partnerships and collaboration. So there's 5 ways in which 5 actions in which we would need to do these. So in terms of government, apply the lessons from the Regional Partnerships Project Program Pool, RCOD P. So this project it's widening participation activities in partnerships with the regional study hubs and universities, and they're evaluating the partnership approach. And I think learnings from that partnership approach could strengthen the regional university study hub program. Universities need to approach communities without those transactional partnerships and being driven by the community. Don't just assume that communities want to partner with you, and look at how they can do that with more reciprocity. Preserve and enhance the community ownership. So please, it's recommended to keep the community-owned element of the hub program. And then also regional hubs can do their own work in terms of expanding their own partnerships, but also more research needs to be done on the hubs. So having partnerships between the regional study hubs and other stakeholders to explore the impact of the program and also the impact to their local communities. In terms of the resource output, so it was time and time again, we heard how partnerships need to be strengthened within the program, particularly with higher education providers. And like I said, there were some really amazing real life examples of these partnerships. So what we've done is developed a partnerships guide that's targeted at higher education institutions wanting to partner with the regional hub network, that offers some guidelines around different approaches to do that. And then it has had contributions from universities and regional study hubs that provide case study real-world examples of effective partnerships in practice, noting that each community is very diverse and one may not be completely applied to the other, but it provides an opportunity to get more information around how to partnership. When I was doing the fellowship circuit, doing conferences and things, I was often approached by university practitioners afterwards, not understanding enough about the program or how to actually partner with absolute wanting to, but didn't know how to do it. So we've developed a What Works guide to partnerships with the hubs. And that's it. I think just to end, I would like to say how fantastic it was to be welcomed by these communities all across Australia. It was an absolute highlight, life-changing, and I'm extremely grateful to the communities that hosted me and shared so openly. That's me in a plane at Weirgibba. It was the first time that the plane had landed in many, many years on the tarmac. We had to get the tarmac or the landing strip sorted first, and we got bogged. So I had to push that plane and steer it out of the sand. So these are the challenges I definitely got to experience when we were out there. So yes, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of the hubs that contributed. Also to my research assistant, Josh James. Without him, there would be no final report.
Hello. Thank you, Dan. That was excellent. And you're making my job very easy in terms of the timing as well. Fantastic timing. I think we're going to move straight to Q&A because I can see that there's some questions that's already come up. First question, Dan, what do you make of the finding that students seem to have greater satisfaction with the institution's specific hubs compared to the agnostic ones? What lessons should community-owned hubs take from this?
So students we didn't seek to make a comparison between the partnership models and the effectiveness between the different operating. What we wanted to see is whether they were widening participation and what the impact to students was. So we didn't make a comparison between whether they were institution neutral or not. It would be an opportunity for further research and evaluation, but yeah, we didn't set out to do that. And overall, students, it was sometimes it made you want to cry listening to the students and the impact that the hubs had. And it didn't matter which hub we were at, we were still getting that really amazing kind of life-changing feedback there about the impact. Christy mentioned before about Olivia. I know Olivia. I play netball with Olivia, and she's from a small regional community in South Australia. And when she was studying, and I'm sure she won't mind me sharing this story, but when she was studying at the hub, it contributed to her success so much that her brother, who was living still in South Australia but didn't want to go to a metropolitan campus and was studying at home, moved to Broken Hill because of the support that he had there at the hub, and he still is using it today to finish his degree. So those type of anecdotes happen all the time, and it didn't matter what model, they still were all positive.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the direction for future research as well. Did the participants identify what does meaningful partnership with unis look like? Is there a sense that hubs are seen as competitors by unis?
Yeah, so and I think the policy and program changes towards the end of last year when we were collecting all of the data probably influenced that. They wanted partnerships that weren't based on numbers. They wanted partnerships that were more altruistic. They found great benefit out of the partnerships. Some of the hubs were participating in the RQuad-P project, so the Eastern Australian Regional University Centre program. Not all of them were, but they seem to have really positive experiences about how that partnership approach benefited both the students and the community, and hence that recommendation to take some of the learnings from it. But yeah, they did describe how they would like it to be, but yeah, it's hard to translate for each individual community. So read the guide.
Thank you. Regarding staffing, were hubs able to recruit and retain high-quality teaching staff? If not, do you have any recommendations for improving employment opportunities for staff in regional areas?
So only hubs with partnered courses have teaching staff. The rest have kind of academic advisors, so general academic skills. They don't have trouble recruiting. There is some concerns in retention of staff, particularly in the kind of managerial role, because you're essentially an executive officer, but you're also doing student engagement. You're also reporting to the government. There's only, on average, like 1 to 2 staff members funded under that program, and I think the salary in which they get can sometimes, especially when you're going into more and more remote communities, it is becoming more challenging to recruit and then also to sufficiently remunerate as well under the program as it is at the moment.
I guess, do you then have any recommendations for improving employment opportunities for staff in regional areas?
Well, majority of the regional communities have low unemployment because which is a challenge. So having the hubs there contributes to people's as an incentive, I guess, for people to come into communities where the hubs are, because they have that ability to provide another education pathway. But I feel like that's a question beyond the scope of my job.
Did students mention connections or mixing with other students as being a key positive of the hubs? from memory, the most frequent responses seem to focus on the staff and the technology.
Yeah, so the staff were absolutely significant, but there were a lot of comments around the student-to-student interactions. There are some challenges because of the way that students at the hubs use them. So there were a lot of efforts from the hub staff to build that kind of student community, so doing workshops, games nights, things like that, where it was kind of study groups was a good one as well, in which they tried to get the student interaction. There were also opportunities for students to kind of share their details if they wanted to mentor other students. There were peer-to-peer strategies that were happening across all of the hubs, but this hub staff did obviously note there's difficulties with that because many of the people using the hubs are female, they have children, they're working or supporting family. So when they're in the hubs, they're there for a purpose. But it was more, that's why I think I mentioned the kitchen. It was more those kind of ad hoc connections, walking in, seeing someone and saying, oh, hi, Ian, how'd that assignment go? Those type of, not forced, but yeah, just kind of those more organic connections that students were making for sure. They definitely commented on, yeah.
Great, thanks. You were quite enmeshed in the hub community, but what surprised you the most over the fellowship?
The diversity, actually. So yes, I am a practitioner, but I have worked exclusively for country university centres in my role at Broken Hill, but also in my role with the CUC network. So the diversity and I guess a challenge for me throughout the project and what had to be managed in terms of my ethics and my bias was managing my bias, but also so my actual and also perceived bias, and that's documented throughout the report, but also going into it with kind of washing myself of my CUC experience a little bit and the preconceived ideas I might have. I was fortunate, so I'm the chair of the Rush Advisory Network. So I've had many connections across my time with the other hubs and have really good relationships, which was beneficial to the project. But I think the diversity and the way in which why they choose the way in which they operate and how those community factors and also the geographic and state factors heavily influence how they approach supporting the community.
Great, thank you, Dan. What were some of the recommendations from hubs for sustainability and enhancement of community ownership in the future?
Again, I think because of the cohort 5 announcement, and it's probably been influenced by that. They don't think that universities should play a role in the ownership of the hubs. And I know that they're in terms of the program and meeting the requirements from institutions to be successful in the funding, they still have to be community owned. It is a requirement. So I think that influenced it, but I think they want to maintain that community owned element. There's varying governance structures across the hubs, and potentially guidance around that governance structure. Governance was one thing that came up a lot in terms of those standards of practice as well, as wanting to need those. So yeah, the community owned elements of the program they need to continue that.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. The next question, I think, is somewhat like a same question, but in a different form,
Okay.
along the lines of universities and their role in hubs. I'll let you have the opportunity to see if you have anything to add to what you've already said. There appears to be a tension in university partnerships. How do you reflect now on the centrality of existing Australian universities in the future of regional hubs?
I think that universities go in with the best intent. I don't think any practitioner is wanting to work with the communities to do ill in terms of their partnerships. I think some of the struggles that we've seen over the post-accord period, where there's changes in the way universities are structured, then influences, I guess, the resources they have to allocate to hubs. And I think it's beyond the practitioner level. I think it's systematic challenges that we have in terms of how to engage. And also we're very new. Regional hubs are very new, and there isn't a lot known about how to engage with higher education. And it comes from both sides. And I think with the policy and funding changes, that obviously created a little bit of animosity between hubs, universities potentially feeling threatened, but we're actually there hubs are there to support their students to succeed. And I think that's probably something that I guess a narrative that needs to be pushed out a little bit more. We're not there to recruit your students into different programs. We're there to support them to succeed, whatever their choice is.
Thanks, Dan. That's a really important message to get out there. And last question, I'm sorry I might have missed it, but what professional development opportunities are there for hub staff?
Oh, they just want to learn off each other, I think. We have had we're about to have a 5th cohort of funding. And I think what they want is not to reinvent the wheel. They want to be able to leverage the expertise from the previous cohorts. They want to leverage those practitioners' experiences and learn more from them. So the Rush Network actually provides professional development to the hubs, and it continues to evolve in terms of its delivery and approach and meeting the needs of the hubs, but they are very diverse. Hubs, in terms of university partnerships, love to learn about what offerings there are and what support services are available from universities so that they can ensure that they communicate that to the students that they're meeting with. So any professional development, I think, and I think ensuring that the hubs are aware of that kind of higher ed policy environment, because they are very strongly focused on their regional communities and meeting their needs. But then the higher ed sector obviously has influence in what they do. So ensuring that the hubs have that professional development to ensure that they're going to meet those policy changes that we see occur.
Great, thank you, Dan. Thanks for sharing all those insights. And I think that's all the questions that we had for Dan. Thank you to the audience for all the fantastic questions. Please keep them coming. And thank you, Dan, for the fantastic presentation and to the great responses. Thank you.